Welcome back. This is, what am I? Spiritual Judo for Jesus. I just was talking about Sojourner Truth and civil rights with special mention of homosexuality based on a comment of a guy here. So now I want to go back to another post. Yeah, I guess I'll do that. See if I can identify it here. Okay, so here's something about Ukraine, which is surely important. Let's see here. Let's see if I find it over here. It was something about Osho. Okay, well, it looks like something has struck. Some algorithm has struck, or maybe it's just the streaming, the flow of input from Facebook posting. Okay, so I'm going to go back to Bertrand Russell. Why does Bertrand Russell blame God for evil? Is the title of my post here at my website, socioeco-econ.blogspot.com. Why does God allow evil? So in this case, here's an image for you. Right, there's Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell, this was from another post that site on Facebook originally. Bertrand Russell comments below, the world, we are told, was created by a God who is both omnibenevolent, all-loving, and omnipotent, all-powerful. Before he created the world, he foresaw all the pain and misery that it would contain. He is therefore responsible for all of it. It is useless to argue that the pain in the world is due to sin. In the first place, this is not true. It is not sin that causes rivers to overflow their banks or volcanoes to erupt. But even if it were true, it would make no difference. If I were going to beget a child, knowing that the child was going to be a homicidal maniac, I should be responsible for his crimes. If God knew in advance the sins of which man would be guilty, he was clearly responsible for all the consequences of those sins when he decided to create man. The usual Christian argument is that the suffering in the world is a purification for sin, is therefore a good thing. The argument is, of course, only a rationalization of sadism, but in any case, it is a very poor argument. And he goes on from there to say, therefore, God does not exist. And so he's clearly making an argument based on an evaluation of one logical position. I went on here to discuss a few things. Here's an image of the destruction of Corinth by the Romans in 146 BC, I think it is, in which there was massacre and enslavement. So I find that a significant, a good point of reference with regards to this issue of the universality of violence and enslavement in human affairs. Now, let's see, I mentioned... So Russell here just is being quoted, and apparently his position didn't really shift much. It was pretty much related to how he treated that position that he was evaluating. He didn't really evaluate the phenomenon of God at any other level or with any other insight. So, yeah, I guess ultimately, well, the argument I develop here anyway is in evaluating the question of what is the question of God? So certainly the position that he talks about in any any kind of affirmation that God does not exist, certainly seems to, needs to be expanded simply because in evaluating children of parents, we get an interesting perspective from this evaluation, right? This assessment. No matter how abusive parents are to a child, if they are not accused of the child abuse itself, it is ultimately the grown child who becomes responsible for any acts of murder that he commits, that the child commits, the grown child commits. And so there's one example, a German, Jürgen Bartsch, not so well known in the U.S., and then of course the infamous Adolf Hitler. They suffered abuse, but Adolf Hitler is kind of an interesting example, right? Because it wasn't his parents who were put on trial; it was Hitler himself. And Jürgen Bartsch is his own story of sad cruelty that occurred. But I also think of another concept in cross-cultural terms, China's Hongwu Emperor, who grew up poor. It's an interesting story, really. Grew up poor, was involved with a Buddhist monastery at some point, but then became, he just was able to get himself in a position where he became the Hongwu Emperor, and then had various phases in which he executed, there were, what do you call it, inquisitions. There was kind of a literary inquisition, I believe is the historical sociological name that's applied, for people who didn't praise the emperor sufficiently or something, and so they were executed, and their whole families were executed, besides other extensive acts of cruelty by the Hongwu Emperor in that case, as one example amongst many among cultures, all cultures. So, or almost all cultures, and so people are considered for their own responsibility. Oh, and the guy, the Hongwu Emperor, was kind of an orphan, right, in the end, and so. So then I switch over to George Fox, and really ultimately we gain clarity by considering positive and constructive examples, right? And that's an example there's an image of George Fox, and what is this? This is an image of death in the Middle Ages, just to create an image of chaos and violence or some kind. So faulty premises, faulty conclusions. Right, so what is the context then of George Fox and the Quaker Friends, who stopped bowing to aristocrats in the 1600s, began treating women as worthwhile human beings, protesting unjust criminal sentences, and in 100 years, their protégés agitating for the end of slavery, and leading and sparking the anti-slavery movement. So, let's see here. Well, with that contrast, then we see the question that becomes: what kind of entity does exist, right? And if we're going to consider God, and there's an image of Ian Whitehead, who was actually the teacher originally of Bertrand Russell, and he became a metaphysical. He was a mathematical philosopher, who then became a metaphysical philosopher and actually devoted himself quite seriously to the subject. And so in my discussion here, I start, let's see here. Well, okay, it's interesting, right? I mean, if we can evaluate a few things in terms of someone like Jesus. We do note that Jesus wasn't merely a fantastical creature. He he did things with relevance. The miracles that are attributed to him were not just random. They were healing or other provisions that or actions that they served various functions, but certainly weren't just for spectacle, and certainly above all the healing. And then the fishing nets, right, in which ample catch was of fish was the result, and we see that in the interesting thing is that we see in the result with Constantine, the emperor, who was actually first a military conqueror, who was actually at first the son of another military Caesar, a Roman Caesar, in the British area, and he was the son of this low-born mother who Constantius, Constantine's father, the military Caesar, threw out because of her low-born status. While Constantine didn't suffer from that, he was trained wherever he went with his mother, and so his mother was separated from her husband because of that, but her son didn't suffer because of that. He was still honored because of his father's status. And so then when Constantine had his victory, became a military leader himself in his father's legacy and his father's position, as a successor to his father, he became then, and had victory and was victorious over various people, and finally Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge near Milan, modern Milan. Constantine then supported his mother Helena's interest in Christianity, very vigorous and strong interest in Christianity, such that she went to the Holy Land to seek the location of the true cross and created a church of the true cross, at the least, and among other things. So that itself is a fascinating combination of contexts to consider in terms of Jesus' legacy already by that time, and the very crucial transition from the Christians as a persecuted minority, and often persecuted, and then becoming legitimated, and then in fact going beyond merely legitimated to a kind of takeover of the society, which was the result of the tensions, the existing tensions that paganism had in its own ultimately it was a materialistic kind of approach, and that would be interesting to discuss in its own right. But then we have the key factor in Jesus's experience being the fact that his resurrection became a key. What is it? It's a key. Is it a cognitive factor? Is it a psychological factor? It sealed the meaning of Jesus' life and mission in terms of healing and teaching about loving behaviors, loving commandments, and various instructions to live a spiritual life, to engage in spiritual practice, personal effort, and this phrase that I now like to use, personal effort and spiritual practice for personal growth, that also then created this community based on these loving commandments. So, but it was his resurrection, right? It was Jesus' being persecuted, tortured, executed, and then being victorious over that, so to speak. But empirically, then coming back to life, apparently, being able to come back to life, brought back to life, and the question being, well, how does that happen, right? In the naturalistic sense of things, it doesn't. And so then the meaning then is that God resurrected Jesus, and Jesus had a special role to play, and that became, he is risen, apparently became a cry, an important cry, and so on. So then, well, then there's the nature of God. And so how are we doing here? We got 15 minutes so far. So then what, in terms of evaluating what is the nature of God then, if we have all these kind of empirical references out of history and sociology, what is the nature of God then? Well, then our question becomes, what is logically possible for God to understand God? So we have the luxury, and I'm grateful to acknowledge the context that we're in, which is this university-based philosophical scholarly context that allows us to organize our thoughts about the subject, this very subject. So we have information about shamanism from anthropology, and transpersonal anthropology of people like Michael Harner, a pioneer in becoming himself initiated in shamanic techniques, and then becoming creating a Western technique that he taught, and establishing a foundation for shamanic study. So all of that, part of the original spiritual practice, the full spiritual practice of shamanism. And so then, with Buddha representing another kind of modern development, yoga representing, and gurus in the Hindu tradition representing another branch, and bunch of branches, and then with Jesus possibly having had contact with the Indian, and the Egyptian, we're talking about the temple priests and the various developments that happened there, and the Jewish, but primarily for Jesus, certainly the root then of him descending from Abraham, right? So the Abrahamic tradition, with his vision, right? Abraham had a very key vision with interesting meaning and context, and so there was what came prior to Abraham, which apparently is interesting also. I've been seeing some archaeological information about the context of Genesis, for example, and so then after Abraham we have Joseph with the very interesting archaeological findings by Manfred Bitak is his name, I believe, and David Roll, or am I mixing up his name? I guess he's a Scottish guy with a PhD who wrote a book, really going into and valuing this discovery of Bitak's for its very apparent correspondence and correlation to the story of Joseph. Beautiful stuff from the Hyksos digs in Egypt. So what is logically possible? And so then we have that, we're not, the human imagination then creates its own problems, and logical possibility, and ultimately a form of empirical possibility. Could God create a rock so heavy he couldn't lift it? Is simply a logical absurdity in terms of trying to evaluate omnipotence. We don't need to push God as a magical entity. We need to understand God as a transcendental and supernatural entity, so that we can make sense of things like Moses and the parting of the Red Sea and the modernization in Jesus' legacy, so that this interesting idea came to me recently, that we don't confuse the end of slavery. We don't talk about the parting of the Atlantic Ocean. We talk about the inspiration of George Fox as the leading co-founder of the Quaker Friends, in the legacy of Martin Luther, right, or sub-legacy or secondary legacy process, right, in Jesus's primary legacy. And so we have these sub-legacies situations, and right, and so then we have the process that went from George Fox and the Quakers to their proteges to drawing in to inspiring university-based activity and other dissidents, and especially Thomas Clarkson, and then modern social movements branching off from that. So logical possibility, and so and then even with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, arriving at Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I mean, considering the negative talk that comes from people antagonistic to the social justice position and the social gospel position that Franklin Delano Roosevelt represented and valued, gives us some key ideas of what's going on. So that Ronald Reagan and his representation of the business profiteers and their pro-rich gospel, as developed through the circles around Billy Graham and that type of mentality and activity, we can recognize the need for progressive Christians and ultimately, for the, what are we talking about? What am I talking about here? For the progressive positions and the progressive entry and the progressive incorporation of of spiritual religious phenomena, of the acknowledgement of spiritual religious phenomena, to reclaim the energy that has been polarized and distorted in terms of the conservative positions of the business people profiteering propaganda, combined with, what are we talking about? It's the political militarized propaganda of anti-communism and so on, and reclaiming that energy through the appreciation of the validation, not just of science, but the clarification of the meaning of science. And that requires then understanding that Jesus was no fundamentalist, and the social gospel itself then is a spiritual religious phenomenon, not merely a materialistic phenomenon, not merely secular materialism, not merely scientific materialism, and certainly not economic materialism. Well, I guess Karl Marx and and even cooperative business practice can fall into secular materialism. And so then the idea is the validation and valuing of spiritual religious phenomena, practice, experience, and knowledge that all go together, which ultimately needs to be manifested in terms of lifestyles and the ability to, it's ultimately a psychological issue, isn't it? The indoctrination of secular materialism, economic materialism, that keeps people from making certain shifts, from challenging certain doctrines and intimidating message channels, right? I mean, so big oil, big fossil fuels are making certain claims and pushing and pushing and pushing, and we've got examples like Elon Musk, who's making some kind of shift. But then we have the input of the green power co-ops, right? Who were pioneered in Denmark in modern times, from their mechanics, from a whole series of events, right? The protests with the nuclear, the oil industry. Boy, look at how I'm organizing all this stuff and getting clear about this, right? The oil industry had essentially taken over Denmark's fuel economy and energy economy. And so then the Arab embargo in the 1970s, 1972-3, then led to the nuclear industry making its inroads, trying to get its foot in the door. And then so the Danish citizens organized protests and reinventing wind turbines, and then organizing in favor of wind turbines and green power, and various activities in organizing until they established the first green power co-op, modern green power co-op, in 1980. right? So then we have the European Union Green Power Network, starting from that point, with Germany then being the next big step, where the citizens there made important steps in amplifying the whole process. And finally, the various steps in the United States. Interfaith Power and Light did a church-based movement. We've got Co-op Power in New England that started in 2002. In 2007, this wonderful story, as far as it goes, and it goes a long way, are two 12-year-old boys and a mom watching Al Gore's film in 2007, and then getting organized to start the first or another green power co-op in the U.S. that is a major kind of phenomenon. It's this major kind of social, eco-social entrepreneurship spreading solar power. SUN, Solar United Neighbors. They're up to 15 states. They've got a low-income project going. And so that makes a nice, visible kind of social entrepreneurial effort that stands well in comparison to the European Union network that has made progress. And there's some things in Japan as well, and Huang Ming, I think is his name, in China, in that slightly more complicated situation. So, God, right? I mean, so that's what we're talking about in terms of being able to recognize then what is spiritual religious phenomena. Medically attested, medically impossible healings with spiritual religious testimony are this amazing aspect of spiritual religious phenomena. For activism, that becomes a part of that can become a part of, and that's certainly what it represents for me, has represented for me, as a fundamental way to identify the need to challenge the indoctrination and intimidation that has gone on. And also, I mean, there's a certain importance of self-protection, and there are many testimonies about that in things like Christian Science, their tradition, and Buddhism, no less. And so, and Aikido, I guess, as well. And so all of that is important in understanding the need for progressive Christians to understand the importance of spiritual religious phenomena and to reclaim Jesus as and the meaning of spiritual religious practice that needs to be reclaimed and not left in the sphere of scientific materialism or secular materialism, and certainly not economic materialism, these three major forms. So, yeah, that's ultimately the book I need to write, right? Yeah, that's what you got to do, man. So, thanks for watching. This has been Spiritual Judo for Jesus, and I'm Mark Rego-Monteiro, your host. Take care of yourself. God bless. Stay blessed in divine love. In the tradition that includes Buddha, Teresa d'Avila, Mary Baker Eddy, and Carl Jung, and all people like that, good people like that, and that relates in Jesus' legacy. So take care of yourselves. Until next time, bye.